Good morning, everyone. So we have a few red issues. We'll start with this one here. Steve, do you want to give us the honors?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, just read the first couple paragraphs there. I'll kind of recap it. But essentially, there's an interface today called iHosted Service that has a start async and stop async method, heavily used. The issue with that is that it's difficult to define ordering on that, and there's been a request from Cloud Native and others to have essentially a callback that can run before that, and it's kind of intended to be used for quote unquote framework code, you would call it. Things like validation and singleton preheating and things like that. So I think the simplest approach is what we have here. There's some other discussion later in the issue that talks about maybe more an advanced implementation, but nothing concrete design wise. So this basically just adds a new interface and only a startup async. It does not have a stop. And then this interface or implementations of this interface are called before the existing one on iHosted service. During start, there's no stop, so it just doesn't affect the stop. And a couple of helper methods were added, as well as support for a timeout, similar to a timeout that we have for stop.
I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. So there's an existing interface, but we're doing this on a separate one so that it's opt-in. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess we could. I don't know the status of using DIM or whatever to add new methods to interfaces, but yeah, essentially a new one is being added here, and the samples below would call this new helper method, or there's this helper method is essentially like a couple lines of code you could write yourself. But yeah, it's opt-in, and it doesn't change the existing interface.
I mean, from my perspective, this is the kind of situation where I think we would be okay using a DIM, and I know we've started using them in this release and other places in extensions. I think the question would be, do we want it to be usable on .NET Framework?
I don't think that we have any use case raised where the people who are implementing startup async are the same components that are implementing an iHosted service. The cases that we've seen in the cases that, because if they were implementing an iHosted service, they just use start async. But these are things that want to get in front of the iHosted service lifetime. So it's, the components that are trying to implement this, they only want to care about start, and they want to guarantee that they start before the hosted services. So I don't think
so. This is not a case where if we were designing the interface from scratch, we'd want to add it to it. It's a totally different thing implemented by somebody else.
That's right. That's right. The sequencing part is what doesn't work well today. There's no easy way to guarantee that you can run up front, even if you implemented a hosted service and only implemented start. And so there are hacks there's the way that it was implemented in the cloud native stuff already. They have a public API. They've got consumption across their stack is as an iHosted service that only implemented start. And that kind of works, but we actually made it worse because we allowed for this release, we introduced concurrent startup. And so you can no longer guarantee sequential execution through implementing an iHosted service. So, we effectively even broke the workaround or the way that to build this functionality on top of our existing API this release. So this adds an explicit guarantee to be able to implement something that will run code in the host startup path and guarantee that it's run before all the hosted services start.
And presumably it's the same guarantee we give for hosted services in that if you have multiple of those, they run in any arbitrary order. It's just that they run before the other ones.
That's a good point. So in the case of hosted services, there is an I list that's exposed, but this is exposing no list. So there's no guarantee of ordering here. Whereas with hosted services, I think that there was a way to try and control your order, but yeah.
I thought you just said that that's the thing we broke in this release.
Yeah, sure. So before you could control it, but yeah, now we allow people to opt in to concurrent execution, in which case you can no longer guarantee it. Yeah,
I see.
yeah. So
the list is the same. It's the there's one instance of a list, and it contains services that can either implement iHosted service startup, the new one, or the old iHosted service, or both, or neither, or whatever they want. But essentially, there is just one list. There's just two passes on that list. But yeah, the for running concurrently on this new feature, which is an opt-in, there is no. All of the new methods will be executed before the existing ones, but they will all still run concurrently unless we add a feature. And so far, we haven't identified a need for that. There's some discussion down below on that, but we could add that later if we need it.
And I actually misspoke about the ordering. The way that people tried to maintain order before was not through any specific list of iHosted services, but instead they would access the collection of all services registered with DI, and they could control the order of those services. So that was the hack. So is actually pretty. It does this. Just reinforcing what Steve said, that there's this isn't doing anything new, and I was actually the amount of control you had over the order of things before was even less than I represented it.
All right, I should know better than trying to raise my hand in this meeting. this is a good break. All right, so there's been some conversation lower in this issue. I started looking at this last API review since we kind of skipped over it, and I'm like, this is interesting. And then I pinged Chris Ross, who's worked on a lot of the original Microsoft Extensions hosting stuff and generally has opinions on how things are ordered. High-hosted services are ordered. We rely on ordering. Like, for example, the server is the last iHosted service almost always. So all your hosted services finish starting right before we start listening to things. So iHosted services are very much order dependent. Having an option to run everything in parallel is interesting. If you don't care about any of your hosted services finishing before your server starts, that's a thing you could do. But then that's on you to know that none of your hosted services are order dependent. If you have things that are order dependent, I would probably put them all in a single hosted service, the things that are order dependent. But looking at the use cases for this, can we scroll down actually to some of the discussion, whoever is sharing the screen, Emo? So a couple things to note, if the use case is for libraries to use this and they take a dependency on HTTP abstractions in .NET 9, that means people using .NET 8 could get HTTP abstractions, I mean hosting abstractions. Hosting abstractions could get upgraded to 9, which would allow them to add this new service type to the service collection. And then the old host would never run it because it knows nothing about the new service type, which is kind of an issue with the way our abstractions packages work in general, and shouldn't necessarily halt progress, which is a point that was made in the comment. But I do think it's something to consider, because anyone who wants to reliably use this can't just take the abstractions dependency, even though that's where all the APIs define. So it compiled just fine, but it wouldn't work as well. And then, yeah, having things that run before other things that are ordered like does kind of lead to madness. Like, you know, you get, so you now have like the pre-host service start, and then we need like an pre-hosted service starts. Like, we laugh, but like we've had situations like that before. I actually like Chris's suggestion. If we really need ordering, I think the int order property addresses some of those issues. And even with the concurrency, right? Like, if a library author is like, no, like my author needs to be negative 100, right? It needs to go first. Like, in that world, like, you know, you if you decide that that should override like my goals for concurrency, right? You could say the concurrency just happens if they all have the same order, and the default would be 0. So I think that works. But yeah, just some thoughts.
I mean, I don't disagree with the, you know, pre comment, right? That, you know, how many stages do we invent? But on the other hand, if I don't think we need like, you know, n stages, right? Realistically, it's going to be a small number, and we might
You
get
say
away.
that we've said that before, but yeah.
I mean, the problem with that approach that you're sketching here is it's basically you would have to say, yeah, everybody gets by default 0 if they don't implement the interface, and then the one thing you want to run first, you basically give that a negative value, right? And it's, I mean, it works. It just feels slightly odd, but
it's way more flexible, because instead of having like, okay, because like basically with the current proposal, you have one choice. You either run before the hosted services or you run with the hosted services.
Right.
This is definitely more flexible. I would also be okay right now with being like, tell people to add their hosted services in the right order. We do this for like middleware and like a bunch of other APIs. So I would like to see the use case that's like completely broken by that. And if there is, then yeah, I would be a proponent of the order property.
I think the issue of that is that the code that is, you know, using the existing interface, high hosted service, you know, is completely separate from the other code, like from native services that would effectively want to add something before that. And perhaps, you know, running at a different time, either before or after. So it's difficult then to, you know, define ordering unless you're the last one to get a say in it, so you can shuffle things around. And as ordering, this interface, I would be defined by the author of the service, right? Not by the consumer, I guess. And I can imagine you might want to have both ways supported.
So one question I have is like, why does the order matter? So if I have to run before another thing, can't I just take the other thing as a constructor parameter, and doesn't that force the order to be the other one gets activated before me? Or is that not how that works for startup?
I think it's two areas of code that don't know about each other, right? So you might not know about these other dependencies.
I see. So it's really about the side effects that startup has that you can't express necessarily.
Yeah, it's kind of like I try to qualify here as like framework code versus app code. You know, the framework doesn't know about the app code, but it knows it needs to run first.
Right.
Does the same issue
Can we
exist
talk?
on the?
Oh,
Sorry, does the same issue exist on the shutdown side? Like, I need to run before something else happens. I need to run on shutdown after something else happens. Like, I shouldn't shut down blah until after the server has already closed, and then I can close my thing that cleans up resources the server may have been using or some such thing.
I think that could happen. I mean, it probably I'm sure it happens already today, and I'm sure there's all kinds of other scenarios for ordering, and adding a full-fledged pipeline and things like that with complete control over ordering and config based everything. But this I think is just trying to address what we need for the few requests that have come in, and so far we haven't got any requests for shutdown.
So, out of curiosity, okay, gotta be careful because the chat is not publicly broadcast. But do we have any concrete examples that we can talk about? Because kind of hand waving, like, okay, hosted services sometimes need to start up in a specific order, and I don't know what specifically I may be running with, but I need to run before them. Like, you know what I mean? So it's like what thing needs to run before other hosted services that's not the server, because the server is always last unless you do this parallel thing.
On the end of the issue, there's some of them listed on the very last reply.
Okay.
Those are from the team that actually plan on using this feature.
Yeah. So
another thought. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say we have options validation in the product today, which would use this feature if it's present. And the motivating factor for us doing this feature is so that we could push options validation down into hosting abstractions instead of having it at the hosting level as it is today. So
that's interesting, though. Like for options presumably the idea there is you want options validation to run before anything else, right?
Right.
So does that mean options validation might need to run before anyone else's registered startups?
Well, that's the argument.
Well, this is the argument for not just 2 layers, but more layers.
Agreed.
Right? If I have something in I have my own startup async, but it's dependent on options, then I actually need the options validations to run before the very layer that we're talking about introducing here. This gets into the full ordering notion.
Or what if I need to load options from a database before it's validated, right? Then I might want to run my thing before options validation, even though most things you'd want to run after options validation. At which point, the order thing comes way more appealing, and you can just document what the order is for the options validation. The other thing to consider is the failure mode. I do think we should think about it. At least what happens when you have a newer abstractions and an older hosting implementation. With the order thing, they at least all get run. With this, they just silently get skipped. I mean, both are bad, but
Sorry, why would they silently be skipped?
So if we add a new interface, right, and in abstractions, and we are now okay, we're adding this new hosted service startup. So I think it's called add hosted startup or something. You can call that. That depends on HV abstractions, depend on .NET, 8. It will upgrade your HV abstractions package. You could still be running version .NET 7 host, which knows nothing about this interface, so it just never gets run.
Yeah, whereas with this, but that's forwards compatibility, right? That's generally not supported, right?
It is supported. It will compile, and that's the crazy thing. Is if you have a third-party library that's I just want to call this hosted service startup, and it's okay, I have a minimum dependency on HV abstractions 8. Okay.
Sorry,
I camera on.
Yeah. Okay. I think I responded to the compatibility concern in the issue. If we care about that, we can solve that through the way an implementation details. So we can make sure that it runs, and if it doesn't run, we could actually throw an exception in hosted service startup and tell people, hey, you have to update hosting too. So that's a possibility if we care about that. Now, I think, to me, that's a red herring. We should think about what we want the usability to be. Not I think that with either approach, we can design for the right we can implement it in a way that we give the right behavior, but we should think about what concepts do we want to expose, and are they usable in that sense. So I don't know, is Eric Earhart on this call too?
No, he has a
he's
different
not.
call.
Okay, so he gave us some signal too that this startup concept was an interesting, unique concept as defining something where people can create API which only participates in startup, and that startup is guaranteed to happen before the hosted service startup. So we have signal from Eric that that's interesting and useful. We have signal from our cloud native effort that it's interesting and useful, and we're finding another case where it's interesting and useful in options validation and DI singleton startup. So that's all like, so think about that concept as providing a component which isn't a hosted service that does start async and stop async and has this longer lifetime, but there's multiple people who are telling us they want to have something that only does a startup thing, and then after that it's done. So that's kind of a different concept. Now there's still an ordering constraint there. So like maybe we still have an ordering problem there, right? And so maybe you put order on those things that only participate in startup. But like the basic premise here is that, well, we at least we want to have something that can participate in that's guaranteed to have this earlier phase execution, and that doesn't have the longer lifetime of the entire application. So
you're
I think
saying
those
these components are just activated once during startup and then they basically become disposable?
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep. And as far as ordering goes, like, so Stefan, were you saying that the ordering occurs today all through sorting the services on the service collection? Is that how everybody?
And that's very common for
Yeah.
any services, which you could have multiple implementations of. I would assume.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you finish. You asked.
Yeah, just a yes or no. Yeah. So I think that same thing would work with these just in the same way as it worked with the iHosted services today. So we're not making it any worse, right? But now I'll pass it. So that was the kind of the idea I wanted to get across. Now I'll yield to you if you wanted to share more about the ordering.
Yeah, sorry. Didn't mean to like try to take over when you asked me a question. So we have used this kind of order property for some other things. For example, like for our endpoint routing in ASP.NET Core, like because we didn't want to make the order you called like map get matter if you were like listening on the same path or something, a handler on the same path. If you really want to override something, you have to have a higher order. And then if the order is the same, there's like a conflict, right, for the route. So this isn't like an entirely new pattern. Using DI order for things is common. So that's what we do for our hosted service. And I agree that if we do the I ordered hosted service thing without the order, or if I forget what's the original I hosted service startup, that it should also then probably run in the order of DI resolution if we're not doing the order property. But having like two ordered things where one runs before the other, it's like, it seems excessive still. And I'm not sure I buy the argument either about like the lifetime. Like, so if you want to do the callback overload, like, again, you can unreference the callback after you call start. And, if you want to define the interface, you can just, not do anything and stop async and then unreference everything when you're done and start async, which like I get is like maybe a little less convenient potentially. Though if all you're doing is in start async, like, do you really even need any fields? It's like a single method call, right? Like it's all like local stuff in that method. So it's like, it's not like that much more complicated. And it feels so much like a hosted service, right? It's just, it doesn't have stop async and you'll want it to run earlier. And so that's why I'm kind of my knee-jerk reaction against a new interface. I do see like wanting to validate options and stuff, and wanting to have a way that it's like easily just works most of the time, even if I call it in some arbitrary order.
I think that this is something that folks have built today, right? And so it's not like we're adding this API because it's impossible to do this today. It is about convenience and representing the concept in a more first-class way, making it easier for people to directly add something that behaves as a one-shot startup. So it's got to make sure that we don't fall into the pit of like saying, oh well, it works today, so we don't need this. This is about convenience. I think that we do have to consider a little bit how it may work today, but we might have made it a little bit broken with the other API we approved this release. So there's that. But yeah, and if I think order is like, it's interesting, but we could add it like, if we added it, we'd want to add it in a way that is added to both iHosted service and this thing if it exists. And if we're willing to add it to iHosted service at a later point, we could add it to this at a later point too. I think so it's not, we don't lose anything by postponing that decision. But if we said that hey, the convenience thing that we want to do for people is say, hey, if you want something to only work on startup, then go and add yourself implement an iHosted service, but don't do that stop asyncs thing, and don't, make sure you unreference everything after your start method, and then, do all these things. It kind of devalues the convenience or diminishes the convenience aspect of this. So, yeah.
I don't think writing an iHosted service is less convenient than the new API. I don't think having a no-op stop async is bad. And I think the primary use case is probably the callback anyway, which would be no different at all. And I do think there's like a cost to having like two different ways to kind of do the same thing. Like iHosted service is the way to run code like before your server starts and before your middleware runs and all that kind of stuff. And it really seems like it fits this well. And having an additional concept that's almost identical, just as missing stop async, is like, I
guess I'd always envisioned iHosted service as the thing that's running, as opposed to the start is meant to initiate the whole execution the entire lifetime. So it's I have less intuition here. Probably I'm putting a lot of credence to the fact that R9 implemented this, or the cloud native effort implemented this and is using it in a lot of places. And we had that request from Eric, and
do we know
a couple other features?
What kind of logic are they running? I suppose it's mostly app logic, right? They don't try to call into framework stuff, and that's why they need to run before the other things are starting or anything like this, right?
No, that is framework level stuff that they're adding.
No, I meant not their own framework. I meant more like our own stuff. Like, are they doing something where they, I don't know, call into options validation and tweak things before the actual services start up or something like that? Probably not, right? It's just their own logic has to run before other logic they own runs, right? And they want to express that without, hard dependencies.
Like Steven said before too, if you have a bunch of services and they're dependent upon each other and you own them, just write one and do everything inside that single service. But in this case, there's two different parties involved.
Right. Yeah, because they have framework and then they have applications using that framework, right?
Yeah. And by the way, there was a proposal or a mention in here somewhere along the lines of, perhaps if there's another interface, I don't know, orderable service or something that you get a call back and you can have a chance to reorder. That could kind of be done here as well. I mean, I think there's different approaches. This was the simplest approach that met all of the current needs, and kind of had buy-off from a couple stakeholders, as mentioned earlier. But there are definitely other approaches, and
I mean, so do we know how old the approach is in R9? It's probably like about 2 years or something like this, right?
We've had the request on extensions to add this support since 6.0.
No, I mean more like once the solution was available in R9, like they used it for 2 years and didn't find the case where they wanted one more stage, basically. So I guess what I'm trying to assess is like this design that they have has proven over time that it's fairly stable and doesn't need much more. I mean, to be honest, like this I ordered hosted service, it just gives me very strong math vibes, right? So it reminds me of how Visual Studio works, and the question is that really? I mean, yes, it's more flexible, but then also, do you really need that much flexibility in practice? Chris seems to say yes, but then if R9 got away with just having this one additional stage, then that might seem to suggest that the answer is no.
I feel like the additional stage causes like the same problems orders give you, an order property gives you without the flexibility, though. In that, like, it's now another stage, so you have this thing where
is the problem the stage, or is the problem that it's represented via a different interface, right? So because basically what you're observing is that the startup component is a different kind of component from a regular hosted service, right? So in your world, they're the same because they just happen to have an order property that is optional, right? So you could make a similar case here and say maybe there is a, if you change how the interface works and you say, an iStartup component is effectively an iHosted service, so it has startup and shutdown. It's just that because it's implemented by this other, this other interface that subsumes it that runs in a different order.
I mean, I'm trying not to talk so much about how it's implemented, just how it behaves. My main concern is that we're going to need something that runs before this eventually. Like, and again, like just as with hosted services, you can kind of fix that by, again, just calling things in the right order. Right. But if that's a good enough solution, then why is that not a good enough solution now, right? Whereas this is just much more explicit when you have the order. If you do want,
you just have to accept magic values potentially in the future, right? As you said, eventually you end up in a world where you say, hey, option validation runs at order 400, so if you want to run before that, make sure the value is smaller than 400, right? So
I think it's more honest about the magic value. Like, I see iHosted service startup as just an iHosted service with like an implicit order of -1, and that's just all it is, and that's all it can ever be.
No, I mean, that's true. All I'm saying is that that simplicity has appeal, versus the other one is fundamentally more messy because you immediately end up with magic values all over the place.
Yeah, and I guess one benefit too is like the way order works with hosted services, right, is like they run in reverse order for stop async, right, which would be the same here, like even if we had an order property. But I guess it's like one less thing to think about if you just have an iHosted service startup, because there is no end thing to run, so it doesn't matter when it would have run. Yeah, Eric.
I was just gonna say, like, are you envisioning, like, what if we added just the helpers here and didn't introduce the new concept of iHosted service startup? So exposed APIs that could guarantee that a delegate would run at the startup time, and then maybe behind the scenes we did all the plumbing for people. Are you thinking that that's like a useful middle ground, or is it like, do you see what I'm saying? Like,
I think in theory you should be able to, like, even though no one does this, implement a third-party host. Also, they're in different assemblies, so how would you do that? Like with internals visible to or something?
no, I meant like suppose in this proposal we removed the new interface, but instead just provide the hooks for people to register funcs, right? And then we give the convenience method, the convenience API to add things that would happen at startup, and then hosting does the whatever implementation lifting. Are you thinking that that's one of the, I guess the thing that promoted the startup concept was more decoupling, but we didn't actually end up truly achieving any, like, there's no real decoupling from hosting abstractions now, right? So like you still have to, because the interface is defined in hosting abstractions, there's nothing that ever really achieved the decoupling from hosting abstractions. So, well, if we didn't achieve that, could we just have registration API to say, hey, I want to add a startup func, and then behind the scenes we would set up the right hosted service to get it ordered in the right spot.
Right. So I guess that's the part I'm confused about. So I like the idea in principle. So if we add like an ad service startup that takes a func into hosting abstractions, and that just adds like the hosted service behind the scenes, like you could add, an iHosted service at the beginning of the service collection. It would run first. Yeah, I mean, that could potentially work, actually. I guess the only concern is, like, if someone else did the same thing, then that would run first. But, like, that's... Yeah. Which is kind of the opposite of what it would do in this design, right? Like, in this design, if you called it twice, the second one would run second, right, instead of first. So it's like, it's a minor difference, but it's still run before all the things using the normal ad hosted service API. So maybe that's enough. I don't know. I think I'd be okay with it. Maybe.
We scroll back up to the API. Whoever's controlling this.
I do like it. Then there's one thing that controls the order, right? You look at the order of the iHosted service descriptors, and that's the order they run in, and that's startup. Like, I do like the simplicity of that.
So the difference there is that so if the interface is removed and the first extension method is removed, then this functionality could still be implemented behind the scenes as an iHosted service. But the guarantees around ordering are like, we end up having to try and enforce a guarantee behind the scenes, which we could do to a certain extent, right? There's the parallel case that we talked about where that kind of broke it, but I guess the implementation could go in and reach out and special case its own service in order to ensure that ordering.
How would it special case its own service? So I was imagining something that just added an iHosted service to the beginning of the collection.
Yeah, well, that's and doing that, if we do today, it has, the last in wins situation, which you mentioned, but then it also has the concurrent problems that we introduced this release. If we special cased it, meaning the hosting code would go and iterate the collection once, find by type name the service that we might know about, which is supposed to run first, and run that thing first ourselves, without honoring the sequential, basically enforce this ordering thing all behind the scenes and not through API at all. So we would we would have a service that we know about and pull it out of the collection and run it first. But
I think that's okay. I still think I prefer the order property. And then like what it would be is like by default for anything with the same order, it'd go in registration order just like today. And then if you had parallelism, they'd run in parallel, but only if they had the same order. I think that's more flexible because then you could have your like start stuff run in parallel too. Like if you really only need 2 stages, right? And there's nothing depending on like the startup stuff other than the other hosted services that aren't startup, like you could just have them all as like a same pre-zero order or something.
So if we add order, are you worried about how that composes with the concurrent flag?
My thought would be, so if you have the concurrent flag, everything with the same order runs concurrently. Otherwise, they run in registration order if they have the same order property. Like, I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
All I was gonna say is I think, like, given that there is parallelism, like assuming we keep that, that's about as simple as we can make those stages. Just be like, that's only has an effect if they have the same order. But yeah.
But since this interface is implemented actually, on a service, it totally puts the onus of ordering on the author, right? I mean, if we could add an attribute, for example, or a way to specify that externally in some way, I mean, do you see any benefit in doing that? Or do you think that, there'd be some sort of convention, or maybe about these other services and what order they define? Because I just don't see how it would work, past two levels, basically.
Well, that's the good thing about the current design is like, is the person adding the hosted service has ultimate control over the ordering. It's a little subtle since it's just based on the order of the calls. But at least it's the person adding who has the control. With this design, right? Like if a library is calling, add service startup, like it's kind of the same problem as with order, right? There's no way for the person adding the library that's calling add service startup to be like, actually, I would want the startup to run earlier or later, like other than compared to other ad service startups. But like you can't make it run different order relative to the hosted service, and that would be the same with the order property.
I mean, that's actually a very good argument against it, right? Because if we go back to the original proposal that came from Cloud Native, the idea was there's a framework. The framework knows nothing about the app logic, and then the person adding the components is the one that determines the order because they know the app logic, right?
So well, that's the argument for rejecting this proposal altogether and being like, as an app author, I might want to run my hosted service before anything else, period. And now this is like stopping me from doing that unless I now rewrite my thing to be this new thing.
Well, but I mean, I think the idea with the new thing is that you get to control the order then, right? Versus in the old system, because we basically say, oh, when you have concurrency enabled, you don't get to decide the order. But I mean,
well, you don't have, that's not a default, right? Like that's if,
sure,
but you're right.
Sure. I mean, yeah, but then it's basically a feature that you can't use ever, right? I think the problem with the property, as you said, is that effectively it makes it decentralized, which kind of assumes that there is a correct order for everything. But in a decentralized system, that might not be the case, right? Because different apps might want different orders, and then you're kind of screwed.
Right. Like I think the order property lays bare what we're doing by actually adding a new stage. Because it's taking that to the extreme. We're like, if we really want to give the library authors control over arbitrary ordering, like why not just give them full control? And you're like, okay, maybe we don't really want that. And you're like, okay, so maybe we want to give them a limited version of it, which I guess could be a reasonable decision. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I buy that argument. I think the problem is there's a difference between the stages and then between the components themselves, right? And I think to me, an order property of type int is kind of saying it's not the stage really, it's the order of the components themselves, right? And that might not be the thing you want to model, I guess.
Yeah, another perspective on it is ASP.NET has some special services that they treat independently of this collection, and there's some ordering forced with that. But I mean, if our cloud native, for example, had their own host or was integrated internally, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion, because they would just add, their service in the same way ASP.NET with reserved interface does the same thing. So we're kind of exposing something that maybe, in one world could just be internal. But yeah, whether we expose the same functionality to everyone, I mean, of course we have to, because we're not, we can't use internal word or keyword. But anyways, it's just a different perspective that we're not necessarily intending all applications to use this. What we have today works fine. It was intended, as a layering mechanism for framework code.
Yeah, and like, I guess the other thing is we've been talking a lot about trying to run things earlier. Like, what if I want to have a startup thing that runs like after all the other hosted service startups, but like before the server? Like, are we going to add like a stage for that? Or like, what if I want it to be like the last thing? I'm a library author, and instead of being before all hosted services, I want to be like after all hosted services. Like, order could help you with that, maybe, but this wouldn't.
Yeah, I think we can imagine those, but we haven't heard the requests for those yet. Oh, however, we've heard requests, multiple requests for, hey, give me a startup phase. And so we definitely take some risk here by like promoting a single phase startup over something that might be more open-ended, like an order property. But we're not doing that just based on a single request. We're seeing multiple scenarios that would be satisfied with just a startup. So yeah, I think that's kind of the reason why we're raising this now, and not that's the reasoning behind having this phase. We've got that signal that says, hey, this is going to satisfy it. Maybe the risk, if we add order later, would these things compose? I think we can come up with a way for them to still compose and not be too unreasonable. And how much burden is it to carry the startup? If we decide later on to add order, maybe add order to both of these, how much burden is it to carry both concepts? I don't know.
I do think, do most people who are currently using the kind of internal version of this that we've already mentioned use the callback or the interface?
We see the cases. So the cases that we only have a couple scenarios that I've seen, and they're using the one that I see are using the func.
Because like, it is tempting to me to be like, all right, we'll add the extension method. Like, it's gonna add the hosted service to the beginning of the collection. We do stuff like that in some other places. It's like, it's a little gross, but it is flexible, and we could add the abstractions later if we decided that people wanted to implement the interface or whatever. Or I guess the big difference that I would see is that like the funcs would kind of run in reverse order, presumably, of the calls to add service startup. If you do like just the very simple, I'll make this like the first service descriptor in the collection. Which is like a little weird.
It's one of the distinctions I had just realized. If we only support the func, then you can't really easily participate in DI, right? How would you get, like, if the object that you had that needed to participate in initialization needed to consume parts, how would you do that?
Yeah, I mean, via the iService provider, but I agree that's not like as clean as constructor injection.
Yeah. Steve, do you recall if your the options mechanism required DI constructor injection in the options validation implementation? You have to go take a look.
I think it did, and people are using options. It's kind of quote unquote options validation hack for other things that need to happen before the service startup. So I have seen that elsewhere. So hopefully that this proposal would prevent people from having to use that mechanism. Basically, when you use the options mechanism, there's a hook that it's not very easy to use, but once you find the pattern, you can hook your own code up that runs before. But again, that's not gonna be under the that's gonna happen before everything is resolved. That makes sense. And synchronously during the validation stage.
Yeah, I do wonder, like, how common it is to just be adding like a bunch of hosted services and then want to call some library that does some validation before any of those services run. Like, how hard is it really to be like, hey, if you call this library that does some validation, like, call it before you add the other hosted services that need the validated thing. Like, because there is some benefit to having, like, giving the full control to the app author, being like, well, you know what you want.
If the app author understands the whole picture, including, the quote-unquote framework services, then yeah, it's nice to give control that way, I think. But I think in these cases, it's not, in the cases that we have, that's not the case. So. Okay, so the original proposal, if you follow the link, or maybe not the original, but at least the one that was requested more recently, is the one that said, hey, we should just use iHost's service and go with that, push things at the front, that sort of thing. And then the discussion was around, and Eric Earhart was part of this, that hey, maybe we should, not have or use that same interface because we don't need to stop. A little more efficient and less baggage. Maybe we can clean things up earlier, that sort of thing. So that's kind of originally how it got started. But I mean, we can fall back to the original proposal and just use iHosted service and add a couple extension methods or the existing ones, one of the existing ones here at least, and then another one that would use the old interface instead of the new. But in either case, pushing things to the front may or may not work for all of the known scenarios. I would have to think about it. It definitely won't work for the async or concurrent case without adding something, without either adding the ordering or some other interface that would force it to run concurrently. But there are options, I guess. I'm not sure where everyone is sitting right now. I think what we have here, meets the existing scenarios. If we go down a different path, it probably would meet the existing scenarios as well. I'm not convinced at this point whether that's going to be better or worse than this here, especially since we can extend what we have here, with either the non-concurrent interface I mentioned in here somewhere, that we could add interface to say, hey, your service must run concurrently, or the interface for the order. I mean, both of those could be added later. But anyway, Stephen Halter, I mean, you're the main one that's providing input here, so your feedback is welcome on that.
Yeah, sorry, and I don't want to like derail anything. I would definitely love to hear what other people have to think. I think kind of my objections are noted. I think my vote for now would be either do the order property or try to build this on top of like the existing ordering of iHosted service. I'm now reading the original issue 2 about decoupling validate on start from hosting, trying to get a better feel for how we got here. Like I do see it, like the usefulness.
That issue brought up a consumer for this, but we actually had independent requests for this feature, and the component that had it kind of pre-existed. We just found a good vehicle for it. So I reached out to some internal folks that might give us more examples of the current component so that it could better help us understand more of the use cases. So I'll share those if we get them with you.
Like, because if this is the only new stage, right? Like, it's fine, right? It's not the end of the world. It's more like if it grows beyond that, and we have like I hosted service cleanup and I hosted service, or whatever. But sometimes the slippery slope fallacy is a fallacy, and this is all we need, and maybe that's true.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I wonder if there was. So imagine if we had some interface that said like, I wanted to, like, what if we got rid of all the, like, we kept both extension methods, but instead of having an explicit interface for this, we had we just used iHosted service. That could also be a viable way forward, where we just found some way to make it so through internal, I guess it's less explicit then. Yeah, it would be harder for other people to implement a host, a custom host. Yeah, sorry for that. Just trying to think through other alternative designs that don't have order, but yet still achieve the goal and allow for participation in DI. But
if we wanted to be really conservative, I think everyone's like fine with the func, extension method add service startup, and that could give us like time to think about whether we want to flesh it out more with like a new service type or property. The only risk would be if in doing so, if in changing the implementation, we change the behavior in any way, and that would put us in a corner because we wouldn't want to break people, perhaps. But yeah, I don't know.
Feels to me like the implementation would be riskier with just the func, because we introduced all those sequencing problems, and we kind of have an elegant way to implement the func right now if we have this other explicit interface. But then so it's
true.
It's not purely a conservative angle, right? We introduce some risk by doing that.
So how do we feel then about this proposal? What I'm hearing is very mixed.
I think let's take the discussion offline with Stefan and figure out how we can find out a compromise here that meets the needs of the use cases that we're envisioning adding for 8.0 as well as the R9 use cases, and then follow up. So
yeah, I hate derailing this. I think the startup timeout and stuff could be nice. But yeah, if you do want to take this discussion offline, I guess include Eric Erhardt and Chris Ross too, probably.
Yeah, I think Eric is in the loop. Chris was
he's
not.
definitely in the loop. I know that, but yeah.
Yeah. So let's schedule a follow-up, Steve. And
it's Stefan, by the way.
I'm sorry
for not. I should have been probably correcting you earlier. But yeah.
I'm sorry. It's not intentional. This is I tried to correct. Yeah. Apologies.
No worries. There's a lot of Steves and stuff. Yeah, I will say, like, this isn't like a hard no, by the way. Like, I'm just like, raising thoughts of like, is this enough? So who knows? Maybe we can be convinced.
Yeah, we'll gather some data to share why we think this is enough, and then I guess we just have to convince ourselves that we're not in need of that order property.
I do like the ideas you were talking about earlier about like detecting if you were using a newer version of hosting or a newer version of abstractions with hosting. No, that's not like part of this API review, but that is smart, because I've seen enough issues where like even though it's not supported, like people do it because NuGet lets you do it. But anyway.
Yeah, one of the later issues we're going to talk about is making that more possible. In fact. So,
okay.
All right. Hopefully an easier one. Tarek? Is he still with us?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
This is regarding the logger message attribute, which is used with source gen for the logging. This request came from Martin for the cloud native scenarios. So basically, today we have just the constructor that takes the three parameters, the event ID, level, log level, and the message. And the ask here is to expose overload for these constructors, which is give flexibility to pass, like you don't have to pass every single parameter of that. The reason for that, the first event ID from Martin feedback mentioned that most of the users actually don't use it, and even they don't know what to do with it. So it will be good if we have a constructor that doesn't take event ID at all. Second is a message. So in the cloud native scenario, the source gen of the cloud native today support the structured log, which is like you can pass like a POCO, and it can be logging the whole serialize everything inside the POCO. So you don't have to pass message. So we need a constructor that it doesn't need really. You don't have to pass the message at that time. Yeah, the same thing. For the level. So the ask here is just like to get these three overloads for this constructor to give flexibility about like for the user which parameters you can pass for logging. That's almost all.
I have a question about the event ID. Like, I thought the intention originally was you should specify event ID because like that's kind of part of your public contract here of like, I'm going to log something, its event is going to be 10. In the next 20 versions, it's always going to be 10.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned about like people really, I mean, don't understand about like what is the benefit of passing this at all, because like this is at the end it will be like produce some number in the logging and they don't know what to do with it. This first thing. The second thing is like we saw the pattern that people just try to pass the same number for all different logging they are doing. We have analyzers that it was used to produce warning for that. I mean, warning the people that you are using the same event ID for different logging message, which is like, you know, was causing a problem for people. And recently we changed this to be like info instead of warning for this analyzer, just to make it easier for people to not like this. What I'm trying to say here is like this proves that people really don't care about like what is the event ID to have with their logging.
So to rephrase, we're basically moving away from the stance that we previously had, that if you don't use an event ID, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, like I wasn't involved in the decision in the first place. I mean, to have like event ID has to be passed there, which is, I don't know why we put this restriction or this guidelines to have in the first place. But yeah, I mean, like if this is the case, so yeah, I mean, like the ask here is to move away from this. Yeah.
I mean, in my head, it's the same reason why event source events have an ID. It's because you're going to want to write listeners or even like dashboards or some sort of things getting out of your logs. And you want to be like, I'm looking for this event. Like, how would you search for this event in your logs if there was no ID?
Okay, my understanding is like people still today can log stuff. I mean, without the source gen. I mean, like without really the event ID, right? Yeah, I mean, so my
yes.
question is like, what? Yeah, how they do the same? I mean, the same question goes to this scenario. I mean, like,
but it's like not the recommended way of doing it, right? Like we recommend use the source generator, and the source generator recommends put an event ID on your messages. So it feels like these new constructors is going against that recommendation.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm not sure about this recommendation is the correct recommendation or not. This is, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, like most of the time, as I mentioned about, like I saw people complaining about the analyzers that saying, yeah, you are using the same event ID for different logging. I mean, which means that they don't really care about like what is the number they are passing, or they are not doing anything with it.
Doesn't mean that they're right though. Like again, what are you going to do with your logs? Like what are you going to do with your logs?
We will use the default event ID internally, which is -1, which is nothing.
Which means you can't have like a structured way of looking in your events, looking through your logs.
If they use an opt-in to do that, I mean, this is optional constructor. I mean, like if they care about this scenario, so they can pass the event ID at that time. We still have the constructor to help with that.
Yeah, it would be good to get Martin's perspective on this, right? I mean, it's possible that basically this is all for temporary stuff that you don't actually care that much for. You just want to get some log output to actually see what's going on, and then when you're done, you're done. You don't actually persist this in the database for like a long time, so you don't actually care that they all have the same log ID. It's like printf debugging, I guess.
But in that case, just turn the analyzer off.
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, I'm kind of sympathetic to both ends of this because it kind of depends on which stage you're in, I guess, when you develop the software, right?
So these new constructors would the analyzer automatically fire? Would there be an analyzer that automatically fires that says you're not specifying an event ID? You should specify one. Would that analyzer be on by default?
I'm not sure about this analyzer. I mean, like the only analyzer that I know about is the one which is like detecting using the same event ID for different login messages. Yeah. But I don't know about like, do we have the analyzers that complain about like you are not passing event ID at all? Because like we have just the constructor that takes the event ID. I mean, like, so I don't think this analyzer exists today.
There's the default constructor.
I don't know who's going to use that at all. I mean, like, it's not useful for any. Yeah, I don't think anybody is using the default constructor.
Really? I mean, why do we have it then?
Anyway, those are my thoughts on not having event ID. It's the same reason we have the event ID for the same reason you have an event ID and event source.
I see logger message attribute, the default constructor being used because in this usage they just assign the properties directly: event ID, event name, level, message. So all the properties are settable as well, right? So you don't have to use any of the constructors. So they can already do this today, basically. They can just say logger message and then they only set message if they wanted to. So in that sense, the constructors is not giving them anything that they can't already do. It would just be more concise.
Okay, so it will be kind of like synthetic sugar for them.
Right. Which, I mean, I kind of hear what Eric is saying. Like, if we strongly believe that is not the right way to use this thing, then it seems weird to give people constructors to do the thing we said that they shouldn't do, right? But then...
But we're already providing the default constructor, which is exactly the same what we're doing it.
Yes, it's just the difference between, you know, that, because it's kind of, it just falls out of this open-ended design of setting properties, right? But in this model, you basically promote this more by saying, you know, we give you a shortcut constructor that just takes, you know, just the message or just the level and the message, right? But yes, they can already do that today.
Okay.
So in that sense, I'm not opposed. But I do think we need to reconcile this with I guess, our design philosophy. Any objections to proving this then, Eric? Or how do you feel about this?
I mean, I'm fine if people are sure that this is the right thing. It's just, it surprises me that like we wanted people to specify this.
I mean, in a sense, that's not unlike other areas of the BCL, right? Where we have performance APIs that we want people to use, but then we also give people less performant APIs if they're more convenient, right? So this is kind of an area where you get less value, but you have a more convenient way to lock stuff out, right?
Isn't our general take on attributes, constructor parameters are for required things and everything else should use the property set syntax? So all this is accomplishable with the default constructor and they should all be rejected.
I mean, it is. It's just that, you know, we do have plenty of overloads for constructors where we make common combinations easier, right?
Yeah, I don't think I don't think we need the level and the message or the level and message. Like, just specify it using the property setters.
So you're saying you would accept the message one, but you wouldn't accept the...
No, I'd reject all three. They are all accomplishable using the default constructor.
I mean, they are. It just comes down to like how common is it, right? With log level in particular, it's a bit annoying because you have to say level equals log level dot something, right?
So yeah, my question, if we can do it through the properties inside the logger attribute, why we expose the second constructor in the first place?
My guess is we did that one first because the statement that we were given was they were all required, and then somebody came back later and decided they weren't required and added the default constructor.
Well, I can tell you.
That's my guess.
It doesn't say here.
I remember going round and round on kind of exactly this in the first API review of exactly which things are required. I'm trying to look up the original API.
I want to say we had a conversation of this, and I think we ended up making them all settable.
Right, and that probably came when the default constructor got added.
Yeah, that's quite possible. Sadly, I don't have version history in API-stuff.net, so I can't tell you when they got added. Because if it's in different frameworks, you get it for free, but because it's an U package, it doesn't show me here when it was added.
Yeah, so Jeremy, I mean, like, why this constructors will be bad if we allow this to be settable in the default constructor?
Our general design goal for attribute types is constructor parameters are for get-only properties, and everything that has a settable property does not get a constructor parameter. But we can't, so that's why I think the evolution was we added the 3-parameter constructor first, and we said these are all required and get only. And then later somebody came back and wanted to make them optional. And so we added the default constructor and said, fine, now everything's optional. And this type is done, move on. And having done that, there should now be no more constructors because nothing is required. That's our general stance.
Okay, so you remember that we introduced this default constructors with the properties, so we can avoid adding more constructors like this at the end, right?
I don't know this to be true, but it would make sense if we evolved it that way. If it happened via some other mechanism, then I don't know.
I think the bottom line is this here, right? That's basically the issue. They can already do it, it's more ceremony, right?
Sure. I'm just reminding our general stance on how we design constructor or attribute constructors.
Yeah,
we generally don't like any tooling that has to read them to understand the different semantics of different constructors, and that's why it's supposed to be one constructor and everything else is an optional parameter, and that's it. Sorry, an optional property. That's our usual stance. If we're violating that stance, then I no longer have opinions.
Well, I'm saying we have violated it in other areas, right? It's just a trade-off between, you know, how convenient you want it to be versus how simplistic or, you know, easy you want the API to be, right? So in that sense, yeah, I can go either way. Like, I don't feel super strongly one way or the other. What would help potentially is, like, I assume these things go on like, don't they go on fields or something where you basically define these logger messages? Isn't that how these things work? So like, if you have like 20 or 30 of them, I can see them being visually quite jarring if you already if you also then have to have property accessors in between, right? It's already like a ton of text on screen, right? So I can see if you have a lot of them that actually helps visibility or readability a bit, but since we don't have a sample here, that's just speculation on my end.
Yeah, usually most of the people will have like 3 or 4 of them in their code.
Right. So then what's the feeling here? Let's make a decision. Yay or nay?
My vote is reject.
Okay.
Strongly reject or or just reject.
Well, it's Jeremy. It's always strongly reject. Anybody else? Eric, you seem to also lean towards reject, I suppose, right?
Yeah, I guess.
I'll add my vote to reject if that makes it easier.
Here we go. That is 3 for reject. I have a slight bias towards approve just because when somebody asks and it looks reasonable, I'm generally more in the sure category, but that makes it 3-1 right now, unless somebody else jumps in. We're gonna reject this.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, I want them, but it will be 3-2.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I looked at the history and it's actually backwards. Everything was optional, and then we added the 3-parameter constructor later.
The premise of this issue, I'm fine with the decision, but the premise of this issue, the very first bullet that's on the screen, is basically saying we made a mistake with Vent ID. It's actually not useful.
Yeah, it's interesting. I still don't, I'm not sure I understand the log level only constructor, even in that world. Unless they expect you to set the message anyway as a property setter thing.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned about cloud native, they support the structured logging, which is you can just pass an object without any message. So at that time, it will be useful to have this constructor that takes the level on.
I see.
Yeah.
So I'm very confused now. Like reading the bullet points doesn't blend with what we just discussed. It seems to suggest that the bullet points say don't use message to begin with. And then also we think event ID was a mistake.
It doesn't say don't use message. It's just that it's not required in the structure logging scenario, I guess.
Right. Yeah, it's 2 scenarios. I mean, you can use the message in the normal scenarios, and you don't have to use the message when you have structured logging. So you have 2 scenarios. Yeah,
I'm just saying, like, it seems like we're saying we want to move away from people using messages, right? Which kind of means you want to move them, I guess, to use log level.
What will the console logger do with a log level and category only log message?
A message has occurred with this lag level.
Like we should probably think about that too. But yeah, the safest thing is like is it that much more syntax? It'd be nice if we had like usage examples. Like, is it that many more characters to do the property syntax if you just want to set the log level than the constructor? You got to write out log level, I guess, right? Or whatever it's called.
Right.
Level.
Log level. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit longer.
Yeah, you have to specify the value, which will be telling like log level dot information, which is more right. Anyway, yeah, but the only thing that I'm not clear about, like, you know, yeah, it's from the feedback we are hearing from Martin is event ID is really not useful and people don't know how to use it. And this is actually this feedback matching what I'm seeing with the analyzer that we have today that detect the same ID for different messages, which is like tell like this bullet is really true. But what I'm hearing from Eric Earhart that this is not the case. Which is,
I think for library authors, we'd encourage them to set it, right? Because you don't know in what context they're going to use it. And it's kind of like Eric was saying is like, you could have a logger listening for specific, logger provider listening for specific event IDs. It's rare.
Right.
Like one thing logging doesn't allow you to do is selectively enable and disable logs by event IDs, which is a shame.
Yes. And also today we allow logging without event ID even. I mean, so this scenario already exists today.
Right, like -1 or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, you can, but we wouldn't like want to encourage it. Like in your own app, you might know it's completely okay, but as like for library authors and stuff, we'd still say like do it, right? Like it's more information.
Okay, so I think we heard a good feedback. I mean, let me take it back with Martin and see about like using the properties instead of the constructors. What difference will make?
Do the bullet points that I wrote here like kind of summarize what we said? Is anything missing that I should add?
Just that we generally don't do constructor overloads on attributes.
I think it'd be really good to get clarity on that first bullet point from Geeknoid at the top. Like, do we really think event ID was a mistake?
Yep.
If so, why?
I think the feedback is clear. I mean, like the feedback is saying this was a mistake, and the reason is like users really don't know what to do with it today. Whoever wanted to produce any logging message or something like this, they don't know what to use with this.
I would say if logging actually supported filtering by event ID, which is a long-standing issue and isn't easy because of the way the abstractions work, but if we ever did, it'd be a lot more useful. But even so, you can filter after the fact, right? Potentially. Like the log ID does show up in like the console log output.
I mean, do we get the same feedback for event source? Because event source has the exact same requirement.
Yeah, but
is it just that people don't use event source as much, and so you don't get the same level of people that are
the way you listen to the event source is different than what you listen for logging. And mostly, I mean, for event source, I mean, the IDs is important in this scenario then. Yeah.
Like, we don't consider this as significant as like an API breaking change, but in ASP.NET, we try to, always use event IDs and keep the purposes consistent. Same with categories and stuff.
Okay.
Don't we have an analyzer that complains? I remember this was brought up at the beginning of the issue, but I forgot the answer. That complains if you don't set an event ID?
I'm not aware of that, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I never saw anybody complaining about missing event ID.
So I'm trying it right now. It doesn't on the first one, but as soon as you make a second one, you get syslib 1006. Multiple logging methods are using event ID -1 in class logs.
This is
like adding these constructors is going against the Roslyn analyzer. That's what I'm trying to say.
This complaint is from the logging analyzer, not the whole analyzer, right?
Right.
Yeah, this is what I thought. I mean, this is people complaining about that, and they were saying it used to be a warning, and we changed it to be info instead of warning because the complaints that we got.
Well, that
Which
I
is
can see.
and at the end, I mean, people was saying like they don't care about what event ID they are passing. I mean, they don't care. So they want just log messages, and they don't care about the event ID, and they want to avoid getting like warning like this.
So if we add these, would we also just delete the analyzer entirely?
Currently, we
ASP.NET
change
likes
it.
the analyzer.
No, if we added this, I think we should make it a special case for -1 at least, which is the default ID. So if you are using -1, so that's fine. I mean, even if you have multiple of them. So we can keep the analyzer, but we will special case the default value. This is my take.
We might need to raise the severity in ASP.NET, like, because it used to be warning, like you said. I remember that, and I think we want to keep it that way for our repo or our repository at least.
I think we need more clarity than users are confused on are event IDs important or not. Like, I don't buy the it was a mistake because users are confused.
Yeah, I'm not
Like-
sure what kind of feedback you want. I mean, like what you want to get. Somebody come to you and say like, I'm confused. I'm not sure about like what kind of feedback. I'm just telling about like my experience while I saw people complaining about this analyzer. I mean,
like,
yeah.
Questions are like, do we really think event IDs are important? Because apparently we did in the past. We thought they were so important that you had to set them, and you had to set them to a unique value. Do we still think that's the case? Because if users are confused, we can unconfuse them with like more documentation instead of just saying, you can't have duplicate IDs, pointing them to a doc that says this is why event IDs are important, etc.
Yeah, but we still allowing not using event ID in some our API. I mean, logging APIs, which is telling like you have the options that you can log stuff without event ID at all. So we are saying like, it's very important, and at the same time we're saying, yeah, I mean, like it's optional. so yeah, I didn't design logging in the first place, so I don't know about the history about like how we decided about like the event ID, and it has to be like mandatory. I mean, for people using logging.
I pasted a link to the discussion in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they're saying like what I'm reading out of there is saying library authors. It's best practice to do this for library authors. And for people who aren't library authors, allowing it to be without an event ID, but adding a Roslyn analyzer that warns you or gives you towards the best practice. So we allow it, and then if you don't care about it, you just turn that analyzer off. Like that was what I'm reading from that discussion in the design document.
Right, and it's not like it's super onerous to leave out the event ID currently. We're just talking about like how easily do we want to make it? Do we want to like effectively promote it? And I would say no.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, like we need to try to get feedback more if we need to proceed with these constructors. That's fine.
All right, then I guess what we do is we say needs work.
Yeah. Yeah, this is should be a simple one. Okay, so recently we have exposed an extension method, which is for the metrics APIs. It's called add_metrics, which is add the metrics to the DI. And of course, I mean, like you see, this is extension method on iService collection. And we exposed this method under the Microsoft Extensions Diagnostics Metrics namespace. And we got the feedback, like, you know, the guidelines for or the pattern we are using for extension methods that for iService collection, it should be under the Microsoft extension dependency injection. So the ask here is just like we change the namespace for this API before we release.
Approved, right? This looks like an oversight. Like when in Rome, like iService collection extension methods do go in this namespace.
Yeah, the point is like we are really not consistent. So I did search in our code and I see some extension methods that it's not under the DI namespace.
We have messed up before. It should be like 95+% are in this namespace though, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like,
So then let's not talk about this. Let's just move on. All right, next one.
All right, so this one is not an API review. It's more of an FYI that we want to bring back.
Fred also wanted to be here for this one, so he asked that we ping him.
Who's that? Fred
Fred from the compiler team.
That Fred wanted
No,
for the next
that's
one.
the
No,
Next one.
he wants the next one. He's here for the next one. This
Oh,
isn't
the next one.
this isn't the attributes one. This is a different one.
Yeah.
Okay, I just can't read.
That's okay.
So what happened was there was an obsolescence policy early on in the ASP.NET layers where types and members would be obsoleted in one release and then removed in a later release. So one crack at the message, and then later those types were removed. And so while this tends to work out for app model layer code, library code is less resilient to type removals because libraries are consumed by other libraries, and in .NET we have type safety and we need these types to be present, otherwise the library ecosystem suffers. So these were cases where we found in particular the library ecosystem is being held back to the point that when people use the extensions libraries, they're not able to just target the latest API. They are cross-compiling their components across many versions and targeting specific versions of the extensions for all of those versions. There's also plenty of cases where people are even not doing that, but trying to upgrade and then facing type not found, method not found errors because of these removals. So we went and took a crack. One of the big thing that made this come up is we're doing a lot of new investment in this layer of the stack with the cloud native effort. And a lot of those components are moving into the extensions layer. And then we have other components which are wanting to depend on our extensions packages. And so we'd like to say, hey, just depend on the latest where we're doing all this work and you get all the new features that have been added and things are good. So in order to do that and make it successful, we needed to look at adding back some of these APIs. So we did a pass of looking at all the API that had been removed from the extensions libraries between 2.1 and now. And so that would be API that was present and then removed, or API that was added and then removed later. And so we looked at all the checkpoints to find the superset of the diff. And then we looked at, okay, what could we bring back? What would be the cost to bring it back? And so we came up with a cross section of the things that we thought would move the bar on the compatibility problem with a minimal impact to our code base for maintenance and a minimal impact to customers from a discoverability. We didn't want to bring back API that would be confusing, right, or cause runtime problems. So we applied a set of rules and determined a set of API, and this is the set of API we'd like to bring back. So I don't know what this room would like to do other than be aware of it, maybe comment on the rules that we followed, comment on the mechanism we're bringing them back, or say, heck no, don't do that. One of the concrete things this did enable, which is something that we've said kind of hand wavy that it's not officially supported, is you can now, with these changes, run against ASP.NET Core 2.1 on .NET Framework and upgrade to the latest extensions without any problems. And like it or not, we have a lot of people doing that or trying to, because folks who are stuck on .NET Framework and want to use some of the ASP.NET Core components are doing so, and then that's preventing them from taking on these other components. So yeah, we've been through a bunch of iterations of this. So maybe scroll down a little bit, look at the principles we followed, look at the way that we're bringing these back, and let us know if there's strong objection or if anybody has questions or comments about it. But whoever's controlling, please scroll down to the API proposal section while keeping the editor browsable part on the screen a little bit higher. Sorry. Yeah, there we go.
So I was looking into it a bit since there's not the full list here, but it seemed like one of the places you weren't going to add obsolete back, but we probably still want EB never just for consistency, just so it's not appearing, disappearing, and reappearing. Like, it'll call it if you needed to call it, but you just don't see it in IntelliSense.
What was that? I missed the.
You had some constructor that you weren't going to mark as obsolete.
No, I
but if everything is being okay, say if everything's obsolete and EB never, then if it's not obsolete, it should still be EB never.
Yeah, I looked into the one. So I saw that guy was an outlier. We couldn't obsolete that one because it's preferred by the compiler. So because it was an outlier, it's the only constructor we're adding back. I went and looked at the usage. In all of NuGet.org, there's only one package that still uses it, and that one package cross compiles for newer versions of frameworks and doesn't use it there. So we won't break that one package, and it's the only user of that constructor. So it's So for that one, I do have a change locally that removed it. That change is also local change is also applying editor browsable as which is not done yet in the PR. But yeah, we tried to follow the rules listed here under API proposal. So Jared mentioned in the chat, which API would the compiler prefer? It's just because we added an overload that takes interfaces implemented by the concrete types so the compiler prefers it because of it's essentially taking the same objects just with a more specific type parameters in the signature.
Right, and I'm just curious if we have the case, because one of the features we've discussed doing in the compiler before is this idea of marking APIs as binary compatibility only. And the idea for that would be that effectively the compiler doesn't think about them in overload resolution. Like, you write the APIs, you mark them as and we just basically say that just exists for the binary compat problems in the run that the library has to deal with. And it's a way for us to kind of move past decisions. It's just one of those we've had an idea. We don't have as many evidence of where, okay, this would help the libraries team enough to get it kind of over the hurdle.
This whole PR would use that feature if we had it, because now we're making it work without that feature. Like kind of that feature would be a better way of saying editor browsable never and obsolete. If we could say binary compatibility only, and then the compiler would never even let people see it, even though it was public in the implementation, then that would be a neat trick. We couldn't do that because we don't ship the reference assembly. So yeah, I'll share the.
Yeah, it's something we would effectively like. And I know you all use a different ref tool, but we would effectively like kill it from ref assemblies too. Like when we generated ref assemblies, we wouldn't include those members. We would just say, no, like that doesn't exist. So yeah.
If we had such a feature, we might, I was going to say, start looking at runtime consumption, like in reflection and DI, and try and deprioritize consumption there. But then that might conflict with binary compatibility goals. So you can't come up with a perfect thing here. But yeah, I think I reached a point where I'm happy with the combination of the both the subset that we can bring back to move the needle forward and the behavior consuming these. One of the things that I was very reluctant about was using obsolete error true. We've avoided that a lot in the past because errors are not suppressible, but there's a trick you can use because you can consume an obsolete error true method from an obsolete error false method, and then you could consume an obsolete error false method from a method that pragma suppresses that. And so if you're really in a bind, you could still consume obsolete error true, which that surprised me, and I went back and tested the .NET Framework compiler, and it allows the same thing. So that was news to me.
Yay for bug compatibility.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
It is. It's
at some point.
Well, yeah. I don't think we would want people to do that, but the fact that you can means that if somebody got really painted in a corner here, they'd have a way out. But honestly speaking, they'd be in a worse corner today because those types aren't even present. So, but yeah. So, yeah. Any more questions about this for me? Error messages. Yeah, the PR is not in its final state right now, so we will apply all the common rules that were mentioned in the issue. As far as the APIs present here, just the XLS or Markdown below could be more interesting for someone who wanted to survey all the types, and then the reasons why we didn't include ones that were missing.
So
where it says usage in-house.
I mean, ignoring the overload resolution issues, are there any other reasons why we don't want to bring those things back?
Concepts that are no longer the right way to do things, but obsolete covers that.
Presumably, like when we obsoleted and deleted the APIs in the first place, right? Like the product owners decided that it was the right decision. We don't want to relitigate that from like a design standpoint, but this just goes to show that like never, ever, ever, ever make breaking changes. Like
in libraries, the binary ecosystem suffers.
Yeah. So
whenever you remove a type from the library ecosystem because of type safety, because of our strict loader, like the binary here, and honestly, the biggest scenario that's broken is our own libraries, which we didn't bring forward, right? But
because we don't test them that way, and neither does anyone else. And
we do test the ones that we tell people to do that, but it's like these things kind of grew up into like they moved from being app model layer to more library layer, and they, in practice, they got used that way, and that's what put us in this corner.
So do we test like 2.1 extension packages with like net8 previews and stuff? Like I imagine
can't
there's
do
some
that.
limit.
You can't downgrade. Yeah. No. Downgrade is the platform does not allow for downgrade.
Well,
but upgrade, yes. And we tested 2.1 app with 8.0 extensions. Yeah.
That's what I meant. And
yeah.
yeah. And to the other point, it's like the other way you could theoretically address this, though the cure is worse to the disease, is put max version ranges on dependencies, right? But then, like, if anyone has ever had to deal with that, that's a new kind of dependency hell.
Yeah. So we don't want to introduce, our package manager is not set up to solve for upper bounds. It's very naive, and the way that people actually use dependencies in practice is not set up to handle that. You end up with mutually exclusive components of the ecosystem, and like you have the user needs to figure that out on their own. And the way that we have been building libraries that we intend for people to build on top of for years has been strict binary compatibility. And always roll forward to later, and then drop out frameworks when we don't want to support them. And perhaps by dropping out frameworks, we might get to a place eventually that allows us to do more breaking changes. But yeah, right now this one is more of ultimately I was on the fence for this for a while, and I kind of convinced myself to do it based on the pragmatic outcome of this. Like, we'll enable some things that were previously unblocked, and I like the result that we get, even if the the single case is a little bit cringy.
I think we're at time, but I like it. How many APIs are we adding for this reason?
The Excel sheet will be a good way to get that. Let me just give you the count here real quick. So,
I guess
roughly speaking,
I'm not privileged
28.
enough.
Oh, you don't? Okay. Yeah, just click request access. I'll give it to you. Sorry. I'll update the link with one that's accessible by everybody in Microsoft.
It seems like this is all pretty straightforward too. Like that the implementations hadn't diverged enough or anything that it became.
In some cases, the implementation for some of the logging ones, we had to bring back dummy implementations, but they were already dummies when they were obsoleted. So they stopped honoring the filter func, right? And so we didn't do anything to do better with that. So they kind of were brought back in the form that they last were in before they got removed. So in fact, we never touched the implementation of the product code, and we tried as much as possible to quarantine the obsolete code in separate files just so it wouldn't leak and create a maintenance burden. So yeah.
So can we approve the concept, or do we need to write out all the APIs?
The APIs are there in the link, the markdown link. I don't think if folks have specific feedback on the principles, then let me know.
I would just approve it. I think the only decision points we have, we could decide to not take certain APIs, right? But then it just seems weird, because to me, the whole point of this is compat, right? And compat is kind of a measurable impact thing. And, we started with the ones that we know people will run into. So it makes sense to me to take them all as they are. and we can't really change them. Right? That's the other thing. So to me, the approval really is at this level. You know, are we want to do this or not? And I have not heard a single argument against it besides that, yeah, we made some breaking changes because we didn't like the APIs, but now that we left a bunch of people stranded on this, it seems like we should just take them back.
On the plus side, if we added something back and decided we want to take it away later, it'll be no more breaking than where it was prior to this release. And if we didn't add something back and we decide to add it later, we could still do that. But, so it's it's a weird place to be because we've already made the biggest break possible. So we kind of have a little bit more flexibility to tune it. I've spent a lot of time iterating and talking to folks who are related to this to get feedback on the principles for inclusion and exclusion. And so I took some of David's feedback, David Fowler's feedback around potential risk, and reduced some of the types that we added. He also recommended that we obsolete just error, which I think is a good suggestion. So it's been through a few iterations so far. Yeah.
So I mean, the principles make sense to me based on the way this whole thing works. Unless somebody has any objections, I'm inclined to approve it as is. Done.
Thank you.
And then I think we're at time, and then I see you guys on Thursday.
All right. See you on Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.